Good day, and thank you for joining me. In this presentation, I evaluate Priceline.com's terms of use, especially Section A through F, through the lens of contract doctrine, arbitration law, and consumer protection policy. We will address 5 issues: contract formation, whether visitors are bound absent an explicit "I agree," dispute resolution and class waivers, transparency and data practices, and concrete reforms Priceline should adopt. I draw from leading cases such as Specht versus Netscape, 2002, Gwynn versus Barnes & Noble, 2014, Mayer versus Ober, 2017, Cullinan versus Ober, 2018, Berman versus Freedom Financial, 2022, as well as statutory and regulatory guidance. Importantly, I also incorporate professor-recommended sources such as EFF Critique of Online Contracts, the Digital Media Law Project's Guides on Terms of Service, the Eric Goldman blog, the Yukon State Terms Model, and the Connecticut Privacy Policy, in addition to Priceline's own terms. Priceline's terms operate as a browser wrap agreement, accessible only through a footer link. Courts often decline to enforce such agreements unless conceptual notice and clear assent are shown. In Specht versus Netscape, 2002, the court refused to enforce terms hidden below the download button. Similarly, in Gwynn versus Barnes & Noble in 2014, the Ninth Circuit rejected enforcement where the terms were in the footer without explicit assent. The Digital Media Law Project notes that courts are increasingly skeptical of browse wrap and require affirmative action, such as checkbox and proximate notice. The Yukon State terms exemplify best practices by requiring explicit acknowledgement and detailed IT provisions that prevent ambiguity. The doctrinal issue is whether passive use equals consent. Courts generally say no. In Segoras versus TransUnion, 2016, arbitration failed because assent was obscured. In Nicosia versus Amazon, 2016, ambiguous layouts doomed enforcement. The Eric Goldman blog emphasizes that courts are weary of inferring agreements where assent is not explicit. Instead, click wraps and conspicuous sign-in wraps are enforceable. Recommendation: Priceline should move to click wrap assent and account creation, and clickouts with proximate links and concise plain language summaries. According to Priceline terms, Section F mandates binding arbitration and waives class actions. These provisions are broadly enforceable under the Federal Arbitration Act, as confirmed by AT&T Mobility versus Concepcion in 2011 and Epic Systems versus Lewis, 2018. Yet, enforceability does not equal fairness. EFF and scholars such as Stremlight argue that arbitration privatizes justice, limiting discovery and transparency. States imposed limits. California's McGill Rule preserves public injunctive relief despite arbitration waivers. Recommendation: Priceline should provide opt-outs, small claims carve-outs, and fee shifting for meritorious claims, aligning with consumer fairness expectations. Transparency is crucial. The Connecticut privacy policy sets a strong example, requiring disclosure of data collection, sharing, retention, and user rights. The FTC requires that material terms be clear and proximate. In FTC versus Sears Holdings in 2009, enforcement allowed hidden disclosures. Internationally, GDPR sets explicit consent standards. Priceline should adopt layered notices summarizing key terms at the point of assent. Section A. Acceptance of terms. Currently relies on constructive notice. Courts in SPECT 2002 and Gwynn 2014 would likely reject enforcement. Reform: require click-wrap assent. Section B. Use of site. Terms are vague. Priceline should follow Yukon State terms by offering precise language and clear conduct expectations. Section C. Supplier terms. Liability is shifted to suppliers, but without disclosure, Priceline risks agency law exposure. A supplier responsibility matrix is recommended. Section C. Supplier terms. Liability is shifted to suppliers, but without disclosure, Priceline risks agency law exposure. A supplier responsibility matrix is recommended. Section D. Prohibited conduct. Overly broad. Best practice. Task-oriented prohibitions with examples, consistent with Digital Media Law Project guidance. Section E. Disclaimers and liability limits. Courts enforce reasonable and conspicuous disclaimers. Priceline should place them near assent, following FTC guidance. Section F. Dispute resolution. Arbitration enforceable but controversial. Add opt-outs and consumer-friendly features as suggested by EFF and consumer advocates. Critics such as Stremlight argue arbitration strips consumers of meaningful recourse. The EFF likewise underscores how mandatory arbitration reduces transparency. The Connecticut privacy policy illustrates that states are experimenting with broader consumer protections that Priceline should anticipate adopting. The comparative lesson: enforceability in U.S. courts is not the same as fairness. Companies that adopt fairness proactively reduce reputational risk and align with international standards. 1. Require explicit click-wrap assent at booking and account creation. 2. Provide layered plain language, summaries of arbitration, data, and liability provisions. 3. Create a supplier responsibility matrix modeled on best practices in the Yukon State terms. 4. Offer opt-outs and fee shifting for arbitration to address fairness critiques according to EFF. 5. Enhance privacy notices, borrowing from the Connecticut privacy policy model. 6. conduct annual UX and legal reviews with screenshots preserved for litigation readiness. In conclusion, Priceline's terms are partially enforceable but legally vulnerable under browser wrap doctrine. Courts and regulators demand conspicuous notice, clear assent, and fairness. By adopting reforms modeled on case law, FTC guidance, and competitive policies like Yukon state terms and Connecticut privacy policy, Priceline can mitigate legal exposure and build consumer trust. Thank you.